George W. Bush's campaign. He's now the president of Frontline Strategies. That's a consultant group. And he thinks that Marco Rubio in Florida still has a chance.
First of all, critically speaking, it was a good night for two of the candidates last night. However, I will say this. I don't know that it matters that much. Florida is, in many ways, the beast unto itself. And there is a Florida favorite son who is currently running. And so, as it stands right now, I think that last night's contest will continue to have some impact on what I would call the the punditry crowd and maybe on the donor crowd, but I don't know that it has a whole lot of effect on Florida.
You're a Marco Rubio supporter now, right?
No, I'm not a Marco Rubio supporter. I am leaning his way, and I know Marco. I think he would do a fine job, but I haven't expressed my support publicly yet.
Okay, now you know Marco, as you say. Heading into Florida, we all know the story that Marco has to win or he's pretty much out. But what does he do at this point? Is there really a case, do you think, given the repeated losses everywhere except Minnesota, for Marco Rubio to continue?
Well, I do. Let me say this. Florida is, as I said, it's a state unto itself. It's very reflective of about three different regions, one territory, and an international community. So Marco is nipping at Donald Trump's heels. If he wins here next Tuesday night, he'll collect 99 delegates. There are still conceivably enough delegates left on the table for someone to catch Donald Trump at this point. And I think Marco could do it.
There have been a couple of weeks now of concerted, big money attacks on Donald Trump. These attacks haven't worked. Donald Trump is soldiering on.
Yeah, you got to give the Donald credit because he is a very resilient, and he's obviously a showman who's not cowed by any kind of attacks. With that being said, I do believe that Republican voters are some of the more sophisticated, particularly the base voters, are the more sophisticated voters in the marketplace today. When you look at Donald Trump's record on policy, he does not pass muster. And it is baffling to me why he's performed so well. I know that there's a lot of angst and anger, but Donald Trump is not a conservative. I think that there could be an unmasking of Donald Trump that could catch him at the end of this campaign process.
Well, it hasn't happened yet, and I want to go back to Rubio and sort of how he sees himself in the larger picture of doing what a lot of Republicans want to do, which is stopping Trump. I know Marco Rubio wants to win. I know he wants to be president. You know this guy to some extent. At what point do you think he looks at himself, looks at the rest of the field, and says, it's better for all of us if I drop out and let Ted Cruz go head-to-head with Donald Trump and try to derail his candidacy?
Well, obviously, I don't think that decision needs to be made this week. Look, I think there is a little bit of an obsession with Donald Trump in the Republican marketplace. I think that maybe the few remaining candidates need to be stopped or stop focusing so much on a Stop Trump campaign and focus more on inspiring the American people about what they can do for the country. I think people are really hungry right now for some leadership. And even in his dark style, in his Carnival Barker style, Donald Trump is offering that strong leadership that people are yearning for. But they need to see a counter to that. And they need to see something that's more hopeful and definitely something that's less vulgar.
Hasn't happened yet, Brett Doster. I got to ask you straight up, do you think your party's in trouble if there's a contested convention or if Donald Trump is the nominee? Is the Republican Party in big trouble nationally?
Contested convention, no. If Donald Trump is the nominee, I think my party's in real trouble. And frankly, I think the country's in trouble. Our brand over the past 25, 30 years since Reagan has been the conservative party. I think that Donald Trump muddles the waters for us as to what our brand is. And that's the debate that we're having right now.
The last stand perhaps for Senator Marco Rubio in Florida, and also maybe the last stand of the brand of the Republican Party as Donald Trump continues to amass delegates heading into Florida and Ohio. Brett Doster in Florida, president of Frontline Strategies, former senior advisor on Jeb Bush's campaign, and also political director for President George W. Bush's presidential campaign. Thanks a lot, Brett.
Thank you, Todd.
Now, a week from today, the people of Florida can play a profoundly important role in helping to lead this nation toward a political revolution.
Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders rallying in Florida yesterday, and as the campaigns head to Florida, there's one issue that officials in Florida think is being ignored in this presidential campaign. There have been 11 Republican debates so far this campaign cycle, and the candidates have spent a lot of time talking about ISIS, immigration, education, and healthcare, but we've heard very, very little on climate change. In one of the fleetingly rare instances climate change has come up among Republicans, back in September, Florida Senator Marco Rubio framed it this way.
So we are not going to destroy our economy. We are not going to make America a harder place to create jobs in order to pursue policies that will do absolutely nothing to change our economy, to change our climate, to change our weather, because America is a lot of things. The greatest country in the world, absolutely. But America is not a planet.
Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders do have plans for climate change, but even they don't get asked about it much. Well, 21 Florida mayors, Democrats and Republicans, have had enough. The debates are coming to their state. Democrats debate tonight and the Republicans tomorrow, both in Miami. The mayors sent a letter to debate moderators asking them to push the candidates for answers on how they would handle rising sea levels and changing coastlines caused by climate change. And let's face it, if you're a coastal mayor or a coastal homeowner, and Florida has a lot of both, you cannot afford for aspiring national leaders to come to the table with no plan. Bob Buckhorn is the Democratic mayor of Tampa. He's also one of those 21 Florida mayors calling on moderators at the upcoming debates to ask the candidates how they would deal with climate change. Mayor Buckhorn, welcome to the Takeaway.
Todd, it's good to be here. Thank you.
What exactly is the situation with your coastal communities there in Florida? What are the specific concerns when it comes to climate change?
Well, clearly we are at risk. This is a state that probably more so than anybody is vulnerable to the impact of climate change. We know it occurs incrementally over time, but we recognize down here, if we don't do something to harden the targets, if you will, to harden the vulnerabilities of our cities, to deal with the infrastructure issues, that over the next generation, we're going to see increasing amounts of flooding as a result of climate change. We're going to see more tidal surges. We're going to see sunny day floods, as we call it down here, where if there's a tidal event, we get standing water on the streets because the water is intruding into what was cities and towns all over the coast. This is not just an issue of puddling after a storm. This is real, and it affects real lives here in Florida, particularly in South Florida.
It's interesting when you talk about the mayor's perspective on this, you're not really talking about massive reductions in carbon and international agreements about energy usage. You're talking about sort of climate change, sea level defense in your city, sea walls, hardening your targets, as you say. It's sort of the other side of rising sea levels.
That is very true, and bear in mind, Todd, mayors are frontline defense. We are the guys and women that are on the ground here. We're dealing with real issues every day, and we don't have the luxury of fighting about partisan politics. Our constituents expect us to deal with this. They expect us to find a solution. And yes, at the global level, reducing our carbon footprint, reducing global warming, reducing emissions, absolutely is critical to the long-term solution. But as mayors who have to walk through these puddles and these flooding, I don't have time for the bickering in Washington, D.C. about whether acknowledging it or not. It's real, and mayors want partners in the fight to protect our cities.
Well, let me pick on two candidates in particular because two come to mind in this discussion. Donald Trump has coastal property in Florida, quite a lot of it, which he talks about all the time. It seems like he would be somebody who could lose directly if those targets aren't hardened. Marco Rubio is your senator. He represents Florida. He talks to people like you all the time. So what have either of these guys said directly to you, or to some of your other mayoral colleagues, about the issue?
Well, I can't tell you what Marco Rubio has said because I've never met him, which speaks volumes about his concern for the state of Florida. And Mr. Trump obviously has significant holdings in Florida. He is building a major project on the Hudson River in New York City, which obviously would be affected by any tidal surges or climate change. So I would think that both of them would want to speak to this issue and would want to find solutions to help mitigate it. So far, I haven't heard that. I have heard from the Democratic candidates, particularly Secretary Clinton, on her infrastructure proposals. I think the Democratic candidates recognize that we can't be competitive economically if we don't have an infrastructure that is sound, that is safe, as we rebuild our roads and bridges and rail systems. So, I am a Democrat, but I'm not the Democratic mayor of Tampa. I am the mayor of Tampa, and I respond to people who respond to the needs of our cities and to the concerns of our community, and I just don't hear it on the Republican side.
21 coastal mayors in Florida of both parties are looking out to the sea and wondering how they're going to protect their communities from rising sea levels. And they are asking publicly for the moderators of the coming debates, Democratic and Republican in Florida, to ask the candidates specifically about climate change. Bob Buckhorn is one of them. He's the Democratic mayor of Tampa. Thank you, Mayor.
Todd, thank you very much.
I'm not going nowhere.
Gentrification is obviously a very hot potato type of word. As a white person, I don't know what my white privilege is.
Black folks are disappearing. You know what we really mean when we talk about gentrification? Money.
Later this hour, WNYC's Rebecca Carroll discusses There Goes the Neighborhood. That's a new podcast taking an in-depth look at gentrification in U.S. cities. And we're asking you to share your stories. Has your neighborhood been gentrified? Have you ever been a gentrifier? How did you respond? In what ways have you tried to become part of the existing community?
This is Christina from Dallas. My neighborhood did get gentrified, and my rent doubled in about a year, so I ended up having to move away. But I was one of the early pioneers of the neighborhood. There's a lot more to do there now, but it's definitely not the same as when I moved in.
We have a lot more on gentrification later this hour on The Takeaway.
The Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance is a proud supporter of WHYY and invites Philly teens to attend the annual STAMP program event. This year's event will take place in West Philadelphia at the Institute of Contemporary Art on Friday, March 11th from 4 to 6 p.m. Teens can experience ICA's new exhibitions featuring paintings, sculptures, videos, and sound installations, as well as fun museum activities, food, games, prizes, a photo booth, and so much more. More information is available at phillystamppass.org.
12:20 on WHYY. Be sure to join WHYY for a look at highlights from Philadelphia's past, plus a panel discussion of William Penn's unlikely vision for the city and the fight for Fairmount Park. It's the 10 that changed America. Thursday, March 24th. For more information, go to whyy.org/events. Right now it is sunny and 74 degrees on March 9th. 74 degrees. This is The Takeaway on WHYY.
Hillary Clinton already had her eye on next week's primary contests last night when she landed in Cleveland and urged her supporters to get out and vote in Ohio and Florida on Tuesday.
As we move through this week of travel and door knocking and phone calling, if you work for me and if you vote for me, I will work my heart out for you.
Hillary may wish she had made that call a little bit earlier in Michigan because Ohio State fans don't like to admit it, but their state has a lot in common with Michigan, its neighbor to the north, and it matters because Michigan is where Senator Bernie Sanders pulled off a stunning upset over Hillary Clinton last night. Hillary still has a strong lead in the overall delegate count, but could Bernie's win in Michigan spell trouble for Clinton's campaign next door in Ohio on Tuesday? Joining us is David Pepper. He's chair of the Ohio Democratic Party. David, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Let's get this out of the way. Who are you for, Clinton or Sanders?
I am neutral. As chair of the party, we welcome both campaigns here with open arms. We love seeing the energy on both sides. So both myself as a superdelegate, but also the party, we have basically maintained a neutral position, and we've worked with both sides.
Okay. As neutral as you are, then look north in northwestern Michigan. Give your most neutral assessment of what happened.
You know, I think what happened was obviously a very close race, and what we're seeing are voters who are responding to strong messages on economics, and I think that'll be something that will in the next week in Ohio, messages about how to lift wages, how to deal with the trade problems we're seeing that have really hollowed out a lot of towns in Michigan and Ohio is something that obviously both sides are talking about and are very important issues in Ohio. So we've actually felt good that both candidates have been talking about a lot of important Ohio issues, these economic issues, and we expect to see that for the next 6 days.
Okay, so exporting jobs, free trade, huge issues in Michigan. Hillary Clinton made the auto bailout a big issue in Michigan. Certainly, auto bailout was massive in Ohio. I was in Ohio when Obama was running, and that was a huge issue there, too.
Yeah, the auto recovery is a big deal in Ohio, especially, frankly, parts of the state that are closer to Michigan, but all over. There are auto suppliers and manufacturing all over the state that were in deep trouble before Barack Obama and Democrats saved the auto industry. You know, we think it is an enormous issue, and it's probably the number one driver of the recovery that Ohio has had was because of the auto rescue and the recovery there. And that led to new jobs or saved jobs all over the state.
Do you have a sense that Michigan's surprise result fundamentally changes the prospects of the primary race between Clinton and Sanders, or does it just prolong it?
You know, I've always thought that March 15th would be the most important date as you start to see that play out. I think March 15th is even more than yesterday, the Tuesday, the Michigan day. I think March 15th with Ohio, with Florida, these other states, that's the bigger day. We'll know a lot more about how this race is going to shape up next Tuesday than we did for Michigan. That was one state, obviously. It was a surprise, and not only was it was close, but Senator Sanders won, and people didn't expect that. Next Tuesday, I think, will be the sort of moment where we know, you know, when all the 5 states come down, including Ohio, you know, how this will play out.
David Pepper, I know you're going to say a bunch of pro-Ted Strickland stuff to my next question, but former Governor Ted Strickland is running for Senate. He's running against Rob Portman, who is viewed as vulnerable. He's the Republican. Republicans are scrapping to hold on to their control of the Senate. How do you think that the prospects of a Donald Trump nomination affects Rob Portman's chances in your state?
I think it makes it... it's already a difficult race for Rob Portman. Ted Strickland has been in office and respected for years. He's been ahead the entire race even before Donald Trump was being taken seriously. Ted Strickland was ahead of Rob Portman. They've spent $12 million, Koch brothers and others, attacking Ted Strickland. He remains ahead right now. So you throw Donald Trump in the mix, and it only takes a race that we already feel good about, and makes it even better for us. And that's because of the unique position of Ted Strickland from a small town. He's been a congressman and gotten votes out of a lot of red counties for a long time against Rob Portman, who's in his first term and frankly not nearly as well known, not just in name but in who he is, as Ted Strickland. So, and again, you've talked about issues like trade. This is the big issue right now in a lot of parts of Ohio and other places. Ted Strickland has fought those trade deals for years. He's represented communities that suffer from them. No one's been more pro-trade than Rob Portman. So not only is it that Ted is known better than Portman, but if this race is going to be about those economic issues, Ted Strickland has a lot more to offer, not just Democrats, but independents and even Republicans that are concerned about the hollowing out of the middle class in a lot of Ohio towns.
We've been giving plenty of attention to Marco Rubio and his need to win in Florida to stay relevant in this race. You've got a similar situation. John Kasich, former governor, Republican from your state. How do you assess his race for the Republican nomination in Ohio right now?
You know, it looks like he's behind, but I'll tell you more than anything, we welcome the national media to finally look beyond the rhetoric and this debate performance to look at the real Kasich record, because it's not what we've heard about. Ohio has actually gone through 38 months now where we have trailed the national recovery. The Kasich record in Ohio is just not good, and whatever happens, we welcome a week where people can actually focus on what's really happened in Ohio under John Kasich, as opposed to what he's been saying. It's been a very impressive performance, but we often in Ohio watch these debates and think, who's that guy on the stage and what did he do with our governor?
Well, this happens a lot in American politics. We all turn our gaze and wonder what's going to happen in Ohio. David Pepper is chair of the Ohio Democratic Party. He is an undeclared superdelegate. David Pepper, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Todd.
Later this hour, we have a look at gentrification in one Brooklyn neighborhood, and it's an issue in a lot of your communities, too. From Jacksonville Beach, Florida, I live in a neighborhood that's being gentrified as we speak. I bought a home in a historic district, and we have a mix of affluent and working-class neighbors, as well as renters and people who just hang out all day. I respect all of my neighbors, and I like my neighborhood.
Hey, this is Evan from Sacramento, California. I purchased a home in a less than awesome neighborhood, and have been doing a ton of work to improve the property in the block. Over time, others around me have bought and moved in and have followed my lead. Our property values have soared, the neighborhood is cleaner and safer, and everyone is happy. Gentrification is not slowly everywhere, it's in progress.
And we got this from LeGrand, Oregon. I like the dirty. If there aren't cigarette butts at the bus stop or buses at all, it's not my town anymore. It's a place for pretty people. Put out that cigarette and share your story. Give us a call at 877-8-MY-TAKE. You can tweet us at The Take.
takeaway comes from Staples, with printer ink and toner cartridges for home or business printers, and in-store print shops that can create customized presentations, booklets, and manuals at Staples stores or staples.com. Staples, make more happen. From Lumosity, offering a 10-minute fit test to challenge memory, attention, and problem solving, with brain games to calculate baseline scores and build a brain training program. Performance can be compared with global averages. Learn more at lumosity.com.
Supporting WHYY PNC Wealth Management. The PNC team can provide insights to help customers make the most of their wealth. More information is available from John Connolly at 215-585-5438.
Bad energy habits around the office can affect your bottom line. Eco Smart Ideas for your business can help with customized tips, information, and programs designed to save you energy and money. Learn more at pico.com/smartideas. Pico supports WHYY. Coming up during Here and Now, starting at 1 o'clock today on Friday, Japan marks the 5-year anniversary of the earthquake and tsunami that devastated the northeast coast of the island and setting off a crippling disaster at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The complicated cleanup effort continues as do the efforts to restart the country's nuclear power industry, which was totally shut down after the Fukushima meltdown. Here and Now, Jeremy Hobson will check in with BBC to find out what's going on in Japan during Here and Now, starting at 1 o'clock on WHYY.
You're listening to The Takeaway from WNYC and PRI Public Radio International, in collaboration with the New York Times and WGBH Boston Public Radio.
So Nike and Porsche have pulled their endorsement deals with tennis star Maria Sharapova this week after she tested positive for meldonium. That was a drug that was only recently banned by the World Anti-Doping Agency. But on Monday in Los Angeles, Sharapova insisted that her prescription for the drug had nothing to do with tennis or performance enhancement.
I was given this medicine by my doctor for several health issues that I was having back in 2006. I was getting sick a lot. Every couple of months, I had irregular EKG results.
Maria Sharapova there explaining that her meldonium use wasn't about performance enhancement. So what exactly is the difference between medicine and performance-enhancing drugs? Here to tell us is David Epstein. He's a reporter at ProPublica and author of The Sports Gene. David Epstein, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, meldonium, what exactly does it do?
It's basically a drug that's used to treat some of the symptoms of people with serious heart problems, essentially, helping them avoid the symptoms of a lack of blood flow to their heart or angina, chest pains, and things like that. But people who have really serious heart problems.
Is it fair to say that the drug increases blood flow, increases oxygen that the body can get?
It certainly increases, those things that help endurance in people who have serious heart problems. Now, of course, it's not really tested for the way that athletes are clearly abusing it, but the company itself in some other countries is actually advertising it for use in athletes, even though we don't know for sure if it works that way, but they certainly seem to think it does.
So clearly sporting culture thinks that it works that way, and if it increases blood flow and increases the availability of oxygen, that's another name for doping. I mean, that's what EPO does and a lot of the other drugs.
Yeah, and I mean, there's evidence that suggests about 1 in 6 Russian athletes are using it, right? And we're talking about a drug here that is for people with really serious heart problems. And so 1 in 6 young, presumably pretty healthy athletes are using it. Obviously, that's seeped into sports culture.
So what's the history of how the anti-doping agencies handle drugs like this that might be used for legitimate purposes, but might also have what they call the dual use, which is also a performance-enhancing aspect?
Yeah, usually what happens is over a period of time, they'll hear about athletes using a drug, and particularly in countries where it's not approved. So this drug that Maria Sharapova was using, she's lived in the United States since she was a kid, and it's never been approved here. But there is this gray area of what's called therapeutic use exemptions, where you have to allow people to use medications that they legitimately need, and so they can apply for exemptions to use things that would otherwise be banned for doping. And there's been this huge sort of outcry from athletes about their peers who are using so many drugs. They're so sickly, it's just amazing that they can be elite athletes, right? It's like all sorts of medications that athletes are getting prescriptions for, and there's this question of, do they really need it, or are they just finding ways to get prescribed things so they can get these special exemptions to use performance enhancers?
Is there an arbitrary nature to how some of these drugs get banned? I mean, does the World Anti-Doping Agency do a bunch of clinical trials where they say, yep, these people ran 2 seconds faster on the drug than these people who are not on the drug, therefore ban?
No, absolutely not. I mean, there are things on the banned list that I'm quite sure don't enhance performance. There are things not on the ban list that will be, that definitely do enhance performance. It's really a tricky thing to do. You know, again, in this case, part of the decision process was knowledge that a huge number of athletes were using this drug in countries where it isn't even an approved drug.
So is Maria Sharapova's claim of medical necessity credible in the end?
I think it's utterly bizarre. I mean, she claims to have been taking it from the age of 18 for pre-diabetes because of a family history. If a teenager were going to be fighting pre-diabetes, first of all, they would do it with metformin, not with a drug not approved in the country where they're living. And she claims to have been using it over 10 years, whereas a normal course of the drug is like 4 weeks, like maybe once or twice a year. None of it makes much sense.
David Epstein, reporter at ProPublica and author of The Sports Gene. Thanks.
Thank you.
I was in there 72.5 years, and I love the neighborhood, the people, and the stink of it. I love it all.
I ain't ready to sell yet, and I need them to leave me alone in real estate. That's like the only way out of poverty to reach real wealth.
Those are some of the voices at the heart of a new podcast that takes an in-depth look at gentrification in Brooklyn, New York. It's called There Goes the Neighborhood. It's a partnership between our co-producer, WNYC, and The Nation magazine. And it's also part of a larger conversation about gentrification across the country here on The Takeaway. Rebecca Carroll is the producer of special projects on race at WNYC. She's also a reporter for the podcast, and for her, at its core, this is a story about race.
To me, it's primarily a racial justice story. It's about race. It's about largely white people deciding that they now, I mean, it's a cycle of migration for black and brown people, always moving according to when white people, who are largely the people with money, decide that they want to reclaim a neighborhood or a space. So yes, to me, it is primarily about race.
You talked to one resident in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood here in New York, in Brooklyn. Her name's Tanya.
You know what's interesting? The other day I was walking in my neighborhood and I saw a black elderly gentleman that I hadn't seen in a couple months, and he literally, his eyes flew open and he said, "You're still here." And I went, "Yeah, and you're still here. Things have changed, haven't they?" And we were like, "Yeah, black folks are disappearing."
So that's the first interview I did for this project, and coming from a non-radio, non-podcast background, that was the first time I felt like this is why audio is the perfect tool to tell this story. Because what you largely see in terms of gentrification in print or in media is the aesthetic change, you know, the artisanal shops, the boutiques, the Starbucks, you know, all of those things. But what you don't really understand are the individual stories from people.
Let's hear from Kierna now. She's also in Brooklyn in a neighborhood called Crown Heights.
It's palpable how a changing neighborhood, when a neighborhood becomes lighter, how the services become better. It's one-to-one. It's like, you know, for every 10 white people, you get a flower shop. You too can have a Starbucks. For your 11th white person, you get a bonus Whole Foods. It's like, really?
I see this in Washington, D.C. as well. And there's a debate that goes on in every city. A fancy furniture store or a street that's clean is better than a burned out building or a liquor store. That's better for all the people around. The problem is not the same people can afford to stay around.
Right, but gentrification doesn't just displace black and brown people who are poor. There are black and brown people in neighborhoods across the country that have wealth or who are middle class, who are renters who feel pushed out because they're not welcome. And many of these places, restaurants or flower shop, as Kierna said, it's like we can go into those shops, but they're not being made for us. You know, I had talked with this woman, Monifa, who has been in the neighborhood, the Brooklyn neighborhood, Bedford-Stuyvesant, practically her whole life.
And it's just so interesting when you go up and down Bedford, which is just like bustling right now with like new restaurants, new cafes, but it's almost like there's a sign that like you don't see the sign, right? But the sign is like, this restaurant is for the white people and this restaurant is for the Bed-Stuy, like the old school black Caribbean Latino Bed-Stuy folks, right?
they have wealth and they own, but they feel as though, you know, the neighborhood has changed so drastically that it's not the community that was when they created it.
So what does this mean for the economics or even for the aesthetics that you're talking about? Does this mean that when money comes, when investment comes, which isn't a bad thing, that maintaining minority-owned businesses is the imperative to keep the character of a neighborhood in a way that's still welcoming to the people who've lived there for a generation?
Very much. I mean, to be sure. But I think even more important than that is for people who are white people, or, you know, white people with wealth, who are moving into these communities that have long existed, many of which are historically black and brown, that they, rather than just take up the space or move into the space, they move into the community, which is to say, take some time to check and see if there's already an existing block association. Take some time to eat in the restaurants that already exist there. Take some time to sort of come into the community, not just the space. That's really important, I think.
The podcast is There Goes the Neighborhood. It's produced here at WNYC. Rebecca Carroll is producer of Special Projects on Race. Rebecca Carroll, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
This is WHYY. It's 12:39 right now. Outside, beautiful day. I mean, it really honestly looks something closer to May than it does early March. For the rest of the day today, mostly sunny skies. We're already past the record high. It's going to get up to about 78 degrees. For tonight, partly cloudy skies and a low of just 54. And for tomorrow, mostly sunny skies and another record high of 80 degrees. It's sunny and 75 in Center City at 12:40. This is WHYY.
Right now, watching this enormous development of the computers, I mean, people probably have this fear. It's very deep still, but it's a fear. Who knows? Probably in the future, computer will replace us. I mean, will control our life.
You're listening to the voice there of Garry Kasparov, the Russian chess grandmaster who was beaten by a computer called Deep Blue back in 1997. Now, Kasparov was the best chess player in the world at the time, and his defeat got popular culture and the news media wondering if maybe machines were getting a little bit too advanced. But it was a different story for computer scientists who love seeing what technology is capable of. Now, recently, Google developed a new computer designed to play a game that's way more complicated than chess, if you can believe it. It's an ancient Chinese game called Go, and today, Google's Go playing program, known as AlphaGo, defeated world champion Lee Sedol in the first of 5 scheduled matches in Seoul. Andrew Keen is with me. He's an entrepreneur and author of The Internet Is Not the Answer. Andrew Keen, welcome.
Hello.
You're not here as our resident Go expert, but what do you think is at stake here in this sort of latest round of pop culture man versus machine showdowns, aside from the publicity and the fun of it?
I have to say I slightly disagree with your introduction. I don't think we should think of it in terms of man versus machine, because I think in the long run it's not going to be Kasparov or Deep Blue. It's not going to be this world champion Go player Lee Sedol or AlphaGo. It's going to be a combination of them both. The man and machine is the killer app in the future.
What's at stake?
What's at stake, I think, is average. The people who used to play chess pretty well, the average Go players, and more broadly, I'm not so much worried about professional Go players or chess players. I'm worried about teachers, lawyers, accountants, engineers, journalists like yourself, writers like myself. The real problem with this highly disruptive human-computer partnership is that most of us, unfortunately, I think in the long run, will have nothing to do. We're going to be out of a job.
Now, that's a different vision than sort of the pop culture vision of dominant robots, which, as we all know, is the robot apocalypse. It's Terminator. It's computers taking over our lives. Not only are we irrelevant, but we're a... That's science fiction. But what you're talking about in many ways is much more...
Comprehensive look at his portraiture. The first major U.S. exhibition of his work in over 20 years opened last week at the Frick Collection on East 70th Street. It runs through June 5th, and joining us now are the show's curators, Stain Alsteins and Adam Eaker. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for having us.
The exhibit includes over 100 works, paintings, drawings, and prints. Although Van Dyck died young at the age of 42, isn't that just a small amount of all the work that's been attributed to him?
It is, and in fact, we're only representing one portion of his work, portraiture. He's also a great painter of altarpieces, history paintings, scenes from mythology, but it's the portraits that are most famous today.
How much of the huge amount of work that was done was actually done by his assistants?
Like many of his contemporaries, including his great role model Rubens, Van Dyck had a very large workshop. So many of his portraits that you see, perhaps the backdrop or some of the drapery, would have been completed by a well-trained assistant. But we wanted to really put the focus on the true masterpieces in the show.
And hadn't he served the same function for Rubens when he was still just a teenager?
Yes, for a while. He worked as assistant to Rubens, painting for Rubens, making drawings, drawing print models for Rubens.
He was already painting pretty brilliantly at the time. He was in his mid-teens. You have a self-portrait in the show that many older artists would have been very proud to have done.
Yes, actually we have his first known work dating from 1613 in the exhibition, which is a portrait of an old man painted when he was 13, 14 years old, which is an amazing portrait, not just for someone his age, but for any Flemish artist working in the early 17th century.
How did he come to be so famous for his portraits in particular? Wasn't portraiture considered a lesser genre at the time?
What's interesting is that hierarchy of genres that we talk about that puts portraiture at the bottom was something that was only coming to being in Van Dyck's own lifetime. And for people like the court of Charles I, portraits were the works of art that you wanted most of all. They were essential to international diplomacy, and Van Dyck really capitalized on that need.
Well, there have been some notable portraits done before, Mona Lisa, for example, but also Holbein earlier in England had painted some of the greatest portraits in the history of art. So why was there this hierarchy? Isn't great art great art? Was it not recognized as such? By the way, it's also pointed out that Velázquez was doing something similar as the court painter in Spain at that time, another very great artist.
Well, in Van Dyck's great model Titian in the 16th century also is, I mean, he's more than a portraitist, but he certainly is a fantastic portraitist. And Titian and many Netherlandish artists were models for Van Dyck. So I think it was this hierarchy was something that lived in the mind of theorists rather than in the mind of the public or of fellow painters.
And you, as you pointed out, he did paint biblical, mythological subjects, was an important innovator in watercolor and etching, but he's probably still best known for the portraits.
He is, and one of the real innovations of Van Dyck's portraits is that he injects an element of narrative into them. One of the highlights of our show is the depiction of Cardinal Bentivoglio, his Roman protector, and he shows him with a letter in his lap that he's just looked up from off stage, so to speak. So he adds this element of mystery. What's the letter about? What has distracted him? And that's a real innovation of his portraits.
In a time when there were no art museums, when and how did Van Dyck become the most sought-after portrait painter in Europe?
Well, quite a few of his portraits were on view in semi-public places, palazzi, houses of prominent burghers in Antwerp and so on, English country houses, townhouses. But he also very cleverly, and in this too he's following Rubens, very cleverly used the medium of print. He worked with printmakers on reproducing his best portraits. And those, of course, had a much bigger reach than his painted portraits.
He didn't just paint royals, but also poets, dukes, duchesses, generals, other painters. How much of it was on commission? How much of it was, hey, you've got an interesting face, I'd like to paint you?
Well, he has a more informal category of his portraits that really are studies of interesting faces he could recycle in these history paintings, religious scenes. And we include a number of those, including a very haunting image of his own sister in the pose of Mary Magdalene in the show. And another thing we want to emphasize is that he often paid tribute to his fellow artists, particularly in his printed portraits. And those weren't things that were commissioned from him, but that he would have most likely made on his own initiative.
It's almost as though he's chronicling the art scene of the day.
Exactly.
Other than his brilliant draftsmanship, was part of what Van Dyck's appeal was part of his appeal that his portraits seem to evoke the sitter's inner life. You almost feel that you can recognize the psychology of these people. A little later, Rembrandt has that same kind of impact, but you definitely see it in Van Dyck and Velázquez. So was psychology becoming a concern at the time?
Well, certainly Van Dyck uses the illusion of an inner life. I mean, we don't know any of these people, and we don't know, or at least we don't know much about their through thoughts and character. But he does evoke an inner life and an inner psychology, which makes his portraits much more interesting, certainly.
Although his portraits tend to be to flatter their subjects more than Velázquez's.
Certainly, I think Van Dyck invents to us very recognizable kind of glamour that has persisted today, a certain ideal of beauty based on slenderness, pallor, elongation of the limbs, and that's something that people were very happy to pay for.
I'm speaking with the two curators of a major show at the Frick Collection of Van Dyck's portraits that runs through June 5th. Stijn Alsteins and Adam Eker, both who are with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. How do you wind up doing this at the Frick?
Well, I actually only started working at the Met on Monday. Prior to that, I was a curatorial fellow at the Frick and then a guest curator. So I'm very excited to be in this transitional moment.
And Stijn, I guess you just, as somebody from where Van Dyck was born, you had an interest, a personal interest?
Yes, I do. And also personal friendships with people who work at the Frick now. The present director, Ian Wardrop, used to be a curator at the museum, and I know him from there. And the reason I would say the show is at the Frick is mainly because the Frick has probably the most balanced collection of painted portraits by Van Dyck, which, as a condition of Frick's bequest, cannot leave the building of the Frick collection. And I would find it difficult to do a show in America on Van Dyck as a portraitist without those works.
Although you wound up getting loans from all over the world.
We did. We
major museums all over the world.
Yes, I think we were, in general, very lucky with our loans.
Van Dyck enjoyed great success in Italy and Flanders, but he's most famous for his portraits of Charles I of England, his family, and court. This is Charles Stuart, who was later executed.
Exactly, and it's one of those wonderful chapters in the history of art where you have a true alignment between the patron's agenda and the artist. So even though he was an absolute monarch who would ultimately pay with his life for his commitment to absolute rule, Charles I very much wanted to promote a romantic self-image, and he took advantage of Van Dyck's ability to capture interior psychology to do so.
And he built up a big art collection. He also, didn't he invite Orazio Gentileschi, and then later his daughter Artemisia to settle in England?
He did, and our exhibition includes Van Dyck's portrait of Gentileschi.
Now, did they paint portraits when they were there?
They focused more on these allegorical historical compositions. Artemisia painted a wonderful self-portrait that's still in the Royal Collection today.
Would you say that Van Dyck's approach was had a really important influence on all of the English portrait painting that followed, at least for 150 years or so? Artists like Gainsborough and Reynolds, and I even see a little Gilbert Stuart, the American Gilbert Stuart,
for sure,
in the work.
Certainly, and it's actually wonderful that at the Frick you can wander from our exhibition to the so-called dining room, which has some of Gainsborough's masterpieces.
And his portrait etchings influenced Whistler. Mm-hmm. So that's the art part, but he also had, we talked about Van Dyck beards.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the Van Dyck, the Cavalier fancy dress.
Exactly, and one of those Gainsboroughs that Stijn mentions that hang at the Frick actually depicts a young debutante in her Van Dyck masquerade ball costume.
And Blue Boy is wearing a Van Dyck outfit, the famous Gainsborough painting.
He is.
Then there's a color. He got a color named after him, Van Dyke Brown.
Yes, I don't exactly know where that comes from, but I mean, clearly we are dealing with an 18th or even 19th century idealization of Van Dyck's art, but also the period of Charles' rule.
Now, how did he come to even be a painter? He was born into a prosperous family in Antwerp. Not the kind of, wouldn't they have expected him to go into business?
A patrician family that specialized in importing luxury fabrics, but recent archival discoveries have really emphasized how unstable his childhood was. His father was a bit of a spendthrift. His mother died when he was very young, and his gift as a draftsman was so prodigious that it must have been recognized immediately.
And Rubens called him the best of my pupils. But then he left Antwerp. Was it just Antwerp was too small a town for him to have been ambitious in, considering the fact that Rubens dominated the art scene?
I'm not sure that was a reason for him to leave. Antwerp was one of the great artistic centers in Europe at the time, certainly in Northern Europe, which was one of the reasons Van Dyck must have had to choose an artistic career. I think Italy, for many generations of artists from the north, was just a logical step in a career. Rubens did it, many artists before, already from the 15th or at least early 16th century did it, and Van Dyck did it as well.
And the 17th century was a really important time in Italian art, although I doubt that he would have met Caravaggio, but did he interact with some of the leading Italian artists of the time?
It's interesting because, as you mentioned, we associate Van Dyck with this idealization and flattery, but he certainly knew Caravaggio's paintings, and Rubens would have been the first person to introduce him to them. So his early works, which have rougher, more realistic physiognomies, are indebted to Caravaggio.
Altogether, Van Dyck has been estimated to have painted 40 portraits of King Charles. Some people say he was a difficult subject because he was incredibly short, and if you want to make him look like an imposing king, that presents problems for the portrait artist.
You certainly wouldn't know that he was short from Van Dyck's paintings.
But he was under 5 feet.
Yes, both he and his wife were quite small people.
Did Van Dyck ever express any interest in the politics of the day? Because Charles was a controversial figure. Later, not executed, and Oliver Cromwell came to power.
You know, Van Dyck is a tricky subject because, unlike Rubens, very few of his letters survive or have been transcribed. We have drawings, and that's his pictorial diary, but we really don't have insight into something like his political convictions.
Why did he die so young?
There's one idea that he really worked himself to death, producing painting after painting, supervising this enormous workshop. And it seems that he really was in failing health in the last few years of his life, but at the same time his artistic powers were sustained up to the very end.
And two of the most striking paintings are one of his mistress and another of his wife. His wife was a British lady in Wedding to the Queen.
Yes, she was. His mistress wasn't.
But that painting of his mistress, Mary Lemon was her name?
Margaret
Lemon, was incredibly influential. He painted her in three-quarter view, and I can't tell you how many paintings I've seen that followed that pretty much have the exact same pose.
And that's another instance where the medium of print disseminated this wonderful composition where she's delicately touching the fabric at her shoulder all over Europe. So we have a portrait of Queen Christina of Sweden in the exact same pose painted about a decade later. So normally a courtesan would emulate a queen, but in this case it was reversed.
She was a courtesan, or she was...
Well, we actually have very little archival evidence, but one of these prints after the portrait that we have in our show is a poem in her voice where she declares that she seduced all the great lords of England.
Now, well, the painting is very seductive as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's a gorgeous catalog that accompanies this exhibit, and you said that since a number of the most important paintings are permanently in the Frick collection and can't travel, that means the show is not going to travel?
It is not traveling now. New York is the only venue.
And we'll have a limited amount of time to see this amazing show.
It's open for another 2.5 months.
Through June 5th.
But I always wonder about the years of work you must have put into getting the show all together, and then it gets a run of 3 or 4 months, and then that's it.
It is an interesting experience. This is my first major exhibition, and Stain and I have, in a sense, had these works to ourselves for a long time. So there is a fascinating thing to have them now open to the public.